May 7, 1945. The location was a requisitioned German estate on the outskirts of Frankfurt. Two men who had engineered the Allied triumph sat opposite each other at an elaborate desk. Beyond those walls, American troops were lost in celebration, drinking freely, shouting into the darkness, discharging weapons skyward in unbridled joy. Nazi Germany had capitulated. The conflict that had devoured Europe, the catastrophe that had engulfed an entire continent, had reached its conclusion. Within that hushed chamber, George S. Patton remained somber, his gaze fixed on the figure before him, Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, the masterful coordinator of Allied success across Europe. Patton hadn't arrived to join the festivities. He'd come bearing a prediction he was certain Eisenhower would ignore. Statements that would obliterate their bond, annihilate his military standing, and be denounced as lunacy by authorities and journalists alike. "We're going to have to fight them sooner or later," Patton declared, his tone measured and resolute. "Let's do it now while our army is intact and we can win." His target wasn't the Germans. Their regime lay in ashes. He meant the Soviet Union. Eisenhower simply stared for an extended moment. For 3 years, he'd meticulously preserved an alliance with Joseph Stalin's government, juggling personalities, philosophies, and strategic objectives to vanquish Adolf Hitler. In American publications, Stalin appeared as Uncle Joe, the gruff but endearing comrade in victory. Newsreels depicted the Red Army as gallant saviors. American youth gathered salvage materials and rallied behind their Soviet partners. And here stood Patton, America's most belligerent field commander, calmly proposing that the United States immediately redirect its firepower toward that very ally before the debris from Germany's collapse had even settled. "George, you don't understand politics," Eisenhower responded at last. "The war is over. We're going home." In that instant, Patton recognized something more troubling than any battlefield he'd witnessed. Eisenhower comprehended precisely what he was advocating. Deep down, Ike understood that Patton's evaluation of the Soviet menace was valid, yet he also understood he would never pursue it. The political cost was prohibitive. What transpired next became one of the most significant silences in American military chronicles. A window of possibility, if such a thing ever existed, shut quietly, without a single round discharged. Patton had developed his perspective not from theoretical speculation, but from what his Third Army had observed firsthand as they penetrated deeper into Central Europe than any other Allied formation. His armored units had swept across Germany into Czechoslovakia and reached the nebulous, fluid boundary dividing Western troops from Soviet-dominated regions. Everywhere his forces traveled, he witnessed something that concerned him far more profoundly than the shattered remnants of Hitler's Wehrmacht. He witnessed the Red Army. Patton's commanders and intelligence personnel documented scenes that startled even battle-hardened soldiers. Soviet forces weren't behaving like temporary liberators. They were behaving like occupiers, planning permanent residence. Intelligence arrived describing methodical pillaging. Communities stripped bare of equipment and animals, freight trains loaded with seized industrial machinery rolling eastward. There were reports of widespread sexual violence, savage retribution, and arbitrary killings of civilians suspected of opposing communism. Entire communities were being gathered and transported to Soviet forced labor facilities. Patton understood war's brutality intimately. He knew violence in all its forms. But what he observed in Eastern Europe persuaded him that the Soviet Union wasn't a collaborator in constructing a new democratic framework. It was a totalitarian empire expanding its frontiers westward. In April 1945, he corresponded with his wife Beatrice with typical directness. He confessed he had no interest in comprehending the Russians emotionally, only in determining how much ammunition would be required to eliminate them if circumstances demanded it. They conveyed to him, he explained, the sense of a force that must be regarded with extreme caution in any future reorganization of global authority. While American negotiators in Washington still anticipated that Stalin would respect commitments regarding free elections and national sovereignty, Patton was witnessing those commitments dissolve in real time. He encountered American prisoners of war who'd ended up in Soviet custody near the conflict's conclusion. Their testimonies disturbed him more deeply than German imprisonment ever had. They recounted having their timepieces, footwear, and provisions stolen. Officers who objected were assaulted or executed. They described circumstances so appalling that some indicated they'd favored their German jailers over their Soviet rescuers. The pattern persisted. Soviet formations were dismantling German manufacturing facilities component by component, transporting complete industrial complexes onto trains destined for the East. In Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria, Soviet-supported communists were seizing government buildings, law enforcement stations, and judicial chambers. Freedom fighters who'd endangered their existence combating Nazi occupation were now being detained, interrogated, and frequently killed, not by the Gestapo, but by Soviet intelligence services. By Germany's surrender, Patton's apprehensions had crystallized into a precise, deliberate assessment. What he presented to Eisenhower, and subsequently to high-ranking officials in Washington, wasn't the outburst of an agitated soldier incapable of accepting peace. It was a tactical blueprint built upon intelligence documentation, battlefield reconnaissance, and a merciless evaluation of Soviet capabilities and vulnerabilities. His reasoning was stark and straightforward. The Soviet Union had suffered a catastrophic toll to defeat Germany. Approximately 27 million of its citizens had perished. The Red Army, though enormous, was severely depleted. Its formations in Eastern Europe were extended far from their logistical foundations, subsisting on captured reserves, commandeered provisions, and whatever they could extract from occupied lands. Their supply networks stretched back thousands of miles to a motherland ravaged by conflict. American troops, conversely, were at the zenith of their strength. They possessed absolute air dominance. Their supply routes extended through France to Atlantic harbors, sustained by an industrial infrastructure untouched by hostile bombardment. American formations were completely outfitted, well-provisioned, and supported by fleets of aircraft that could, in Patton's estimation, annihilate Soviet supply and communication networks without impediment. To Under-Secretary of War Robert Patterson, Patton articulated his judgment in harsh terminology that same month of May 1945. We could beat the Russians in 6 weeks. The Soviet Union, he contended, possessed no genuine strategic aerial bombardment capability. Its air defenses were inadequate. American air supremacy alone could shred Soviet logistics thoroughly. On terrain, Soviet tank manufacturing was remarkable in volume, but after years of uninterrupted warfare, their armored divisions were exhausted and mechanically suspect. American M4 Sherman tanks might not possess the armor of certain German or Soviet designs, but they were trustworthy, and thousands stood ready for combat. Most critical to Patton was the psychological element. Soviet soldiers had battled ferociously to protect their territory, but now they were being commanded to garrison nations that weren't theirs, dominating populations that rejected them. Many of these troops, he suspected, had minimal interest in permanently occupying foreign territories. If an American offensive drove eastward, Patton anticipated that Red Army morale would disintegrate. He was convinced that substantial numbers of Soviet soldiers would capitulate, abandon their posts, or simply decline to engage. Then arrived the most contentious component of his recommendation. "We can arm the Germans," Patton proposed. Throughout Europe, hundreds of thousands of former Wehrmacht soldiers occupied prisoner-of-war facilities, confronting uncertain destinies. Many despised and dreaded the Russians far more intensely than they resented the Americans or British. In Patton's perspective, these men could be re-equipped, restructured under fresh leadership, and deployed against the Soviets. "I'd rather have a German division with me than a Soviet one," he documented. To the political apparatus in Washington, this proposition was abhorrent. The United States had just expended tremendous resources and casualties defeating Nazi Germany. To rearm German forces again, even under Allied supervision, appeared like a betrayal of everything the conflict had represented. But Patton's reasoning followed a brutal calculation. If the Soviets constituted the next danger, why not utilize the adversaries of that adversary, however recently vanquished, to obstruct their advancement? Within weeks, portions of Patton's statements reached the press. The portrait rendered wasn't of a pragmatic strategist making a severe calculation, but of an irresponsible warmonger who'd overstepped, someone who sympathized with Germans and was fixated on initiating another conflict. Eisenhower possessed reasons to dismiss Patton's blueprint beyond apprehension of negative publicity. The American population desperately wanted to retrieve their sons home. Congress was already insisting upon swift demobilization and cautioning against fresh European entanglements. Operationally, American forces had been positioned to occupy Germany, not to advance deeper into Poland and beyond. Supply networks would require reorganization at enormous expense. But beneath these pragmatic barriers lay a more fundamental obstacle: politics. Harry Truman had only recently assumed the presidency following Franklin Roosevelt's passing. He was still establishing his footing, still encompassed by many of Roosevelt's counselors, and still publicly devoted to a strategy of cooperation with Stalin. At Yalta, the Allies had established a framework for post-war Europe that recognized spheres of influence and guaranteed free elections in liberated nations. To recommend attacking the Soviet Union in that environment would be perceived as destroying solemn agreements. Eisenhower recognized this. If he delivered a blueprint like Patton's to the president, he'd be condemned as a warmonger, a man who desired to ignite a new global conflict just as the previous one concluded. The press would crucify him. Congress would abandon him. His reputation as the composed, reliable architect of victory would be obliterated. He also authentically believed that diplomacy could succeed. Like many leaders of that period, Eisenhower hoped that once the wartime emergency passed, the Soviet Union would moderate, that tensions would diminish, and that the newly established United Nations could furnish a platform to settle disputes. He contemplated in terms of institutions, agreements, and political mechanisms. Patton contemplated in terms of opportunities and force. George sees the world as a battlefield, Eisenhower informed his chief of staff. He doesn't understand that we have to live with these people. In this confrontation, Patton wasn't entirely isolated. Across the English Channel, Winston Churchill was arriving at comparable conclusions. Churchill had mistrusted Bolshevism since the Russian Revolution of 1917. He'd only aligned with the Soviets from necessity to defeat the greater immediate menace of Hitler. Even as the conflict concluded, he cautioned that Soviet aspirations didn't terminate with defeating the Nazis. By April 1945, Churchill was transmitting increasingly pressing messages to Truman and Eisenhower. He implored them to advance Western forces as far eastward as feasible before the Red Army solidified its control. He wanted American and British troops, not Soviet forces, entering cities like Berlin, Prague, and Vienna. On May 12, 1945, Churchill employed a phrase that would soon achieve notoriety. "An iron curtain," he communicated to Truman, "is drawn down upon their front." Behind that partition, he cautioned, nobody genuinely understood what was transpiring, but he suspected that liberty was being extinguished. That identical month, Churchill directed his military strategists to construct a daring and unsettling concept: Operation Unthinkable. It was fundamentally an Allied assault designed to expel Soviet forces from Poland and Eastern Europe, employing re-equipped German formations alongside British and American divisions. The British Chiefs of Staff evaluated the concept. Their determination was grave, but not dismissive. Under appropriate circumstances, and if implemented immediately, they believed such an operation was militarily achievable. It would be expensive and necessitate complete dedication, but it might prevail in driving the Red Army backward. Churchill transmitted the blueprint to Truman. The American president scarcely hesitated before dismissing it. The concept of attacking the Soviet Union, particularly with German soldiers fighting under Allied authority, repulsed him. The political and ethical ramifications were too immense to contemplate. When Patton discovered that Churchill had contemplated essentially the identical strategy he'd championed, he experienced a bitter validation. "At least one man in authority understands what we're facing," he informed his staff. Within months, Churchill's apprehensions began materializing. Soviet dominance over Eastern Europe intensified. Promised elections were postponed, manipulated, or abandoned entirely. Opposition figures vanished into prisons or graves. Communist parties supported by Soviet security apparatus seized control of police, administrations, and media. Back in the United States, the manner the press discussed Patton transformed dramatically. Throughout the conflict, he'd been characterized as a vibrant, if controversial, hero, the flamboyant tank commander whose profane addresses motivated troops and terrorized Germans. In May and June 1945, however, the narrative shifted. Reporters seized upon his severe statements about the Soviets and his recommendation to re-equip German formations. Columnist Drew Pearson labeled Patton's remarks deeply concerning, suggesting that the general's judgment might be deteriorating. At a moment when the nation yearned for peace, Pearson said Patton appeared determined to provoke another catastrophic conflict. Editorials in prominent newspapers contended that his statements revealed a dangerous ignorance of diplomatic reality. Magazines openly questioned whether this brilliant battlefield commander was simply incapable of adapting to peacetime. None of these publications seriously scrutinized the reports his intelligence teams were transmitting from Eastern Europe. They didn't investigate Soviet atrocities or the systematic installation of puppet administrations. The narrative solidified. Patton was a magnificent warrior, but also an unstable remnant of combat, unsuited for the emerging world. Pressure on Eisenhower intensified. By August 1945, officials in Washington were clarifying that Patton's public criticisms were unacceptable. The catalyst emerged from a completely separate policy debate: denazification. At a press conference, Patton was questioned about efforts to eliminate all former Nazi Party members from positions in the German administration. He responded with characteristic bluntness. Many of these individuals, he maintained, had joined the party for pragmatic reasons, not ideological devotion. To remove all of them from authority was, in his terminology, stupid. He compared the situation to an American political race, stating that belonging to the Nazi Party in Germany was frequently no more consequential than being a Democrat or a Republican back home. The comment was incendiary. Reported without context, it sounded like Patton was equating membership in a murderous, totalitarian movement with participation in a mainstream American political party. Headlines accused him of minimizing Nazi atrocities. Politicians condemned him. The controversy provided Eisenhower the justification he required. On September 28, 1945, Eisenhower removed Patton from command of the Third Army. Officially, the rationale was his inappropriate comments about denazification. Unofficially, everyone in Patton's circle understood that his persistent warnings about the Soviets had played an equally significant role. Stripped of command, Patton devoted his final months in Europe doing what he could, observing, documenting, and warning. His correspondence from October and November 1945 reads like a fusion of military analysis and prophecy. He urged American leaders to preserve a posture of strength, to maintain their boots polished and bayonets prepared, and to present the Red Army an unmistakable image of power. This, he emphasized, was the only language Moscow genuinely respected. If the United States disarmed and relaxed, he cautioned, victory over Germany would prove meaningless. They might have defeated one adversary only to surrender the field to another. In early December of that year, Patton met again with Under-Secretary Patterson. He articulated his grim prediction. The Soviets, he stated, wouldn't withdraw from Eastern Europe. They would transform temporary occupation into permanent dominance. They would disseminate communism through Western Europe by subversion, intimidation, and, when necessary, force. Eventually, the United States would be drawn into military confrontation with them. We're going to fight them eventually, he reiterated. In 5 years, or 10 years, or 20 years, we'll wish we'd done it in 1945 when we had the chance. Patterson listened courteously. Then, he delivered the same answer Eisenhower had, in more bureaucratic terminology. Washington possessed no appetite for confrontation. The American people desired peace, not another crusade. Whatever Patton observed on the ground, his proposed resolution was politically unfeasible. 3 days later, on December 9, 1945, Patton's staff car was involved in an accident near Mannheim. A truck suddenly veered across his vehicle's trajectory. The general was thrown forward, sustaining a severe neck injury that paralyzed him from the neck downward. Other passengers in the car departed with minor injuries. Patton, the man who'd survived innumerable battles at the front, was fatally wounded in what appeared to be an ordinary traffic accident. He lingered in a hospital bed for almost 2 weeks, unable to move. On December 21, 1945, George S. Patton died at the age of 60. The timing of the accident and the peculiar circumstances surrounding it sparked rumors and speculation almost immediately. Some highlighted the truck driver's strange statements. Others noted the coincidence that the one general most vocal about the Soviet threat had been silenced days after delivering a final dire warning to Washington. But no substantial evidence of assassination has ever surfaced. The more reasonable conclusion is that it was a tragic accident, one that nevertheless removed from the stage the loudest voice demanding a confrontation with Moscow at its weakest moment. In the years that ensued, events unfolded in a pattern that eerily mirrored Patton's warnings. By 1946, Soviet power in Eastern Europe was cemented. Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria all came under communist rule. The free elections promised at Yalta turned out to be an illusion. In Poland, resistance leaders who'd fought the Nazis for 6 years were arrested, tried on fabricated charges, and either executed or sent to labor camps deep inside the Soviet Union. In Czechoslovakia, a communist coup in 1948 toppled the democratic government. That same year, Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk died in a mysterious fall from a window, officially ruled suicide, but widely believed to be murder. The pattern repeated across nation after nation. Soviet occupation was followed by the installation of communist governments, the crushing of opposition parties, the seizure of property, and the creation of secret police loyal to Moscow. Between 1945 and 1989, communist regimes in Eastern Europe and the broader Soviet bloc killed approximately 1 million people. Millions more were imprisoned, tortured, or lived under daily oppression. The Iron Curtain that Churchill had described became a literal border of barbed wire, concrete barriers, and guard towers. The Cold War that Patton had wanted to prevent lasted roughly 45 years. It cost trillions of dollars in military spending and took millions of lives in proxy wars from Korea to Vietnam, Afghanistan to Angola. By 1949, the Soviet Union had tested its own atomic bomb, ending America's nuclear monopoly and beginning an era of mutual assured destruction. By 1950, faced with North Korean aggression backed by Moscow and Beijing, the United States found itself in exactly the kind of military clash with communist forces that Patton had predicted, except now under far more dangerous circumstances. Patton's argument had never been that war with the Soviets could be avoided entirely. His claim was that the moment of Germany's surrender in 1945 was the safest time to confront them militarily. The Red Army was exhausted. Soviet industry was in ruins. American power was at its peak. If the confrontation was inevitable, he believed, better to face it then than to wait for the Soviets to recover, rearm, and acquire nuclear weapons. Whether his military judgment was entirely sound remains debated among historians and strategists. What's far less debatable is that the broad outline of his warnings was confirmed by what followed. Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe did become effectively permanent until the late 1980s. Communist expansion did spread worldwide. Military confrontation with communist forces did occur repeatedly at tremendous cost. By 1947, but many progressives who'd supported Roosevelt's more optimistic approach to Moscow had to acknowledge that something fundamental had gone wrong. George Kennan's famous long telegram from Moscow described the Soviet system as inherently expansionist and ideologically committed to undermining the West, language that, in more measured tones, closely echoed Patton's visceral warnings from 1945. The Truman Doctrine, announced that same year, committed the United States to a policy of containing Soviet influence wherever it tried to spread. But containment came with its own tragic costs. It accepted Soviet domination of Eastern Europe as a grim reality, drawing the line further west. It meant fighting limited wars in Asia instead of risking a general war in Europe. It meant living for decades under the threat of nuclear annihilation. Conservative critics would later hold up Patton as a prophetic figure, a man who'd seen what others refused to see. General Douglas MacArthur, who would clash with Truman over strategy in the Korean War, wrote that Patton understood the nature of communism and knew it had to be confronted with force. His removal, MacArthur argued, was a tragedy with lasting consequences. Decades later, Ronald Reagan invoked Patton's warnings as he argued that the United States must take a stance of strength and moral clarity toward what he called the evil empire. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, some conservatives looked back to Patton's May 1945 conversation with Eisenhower. Reagan's policy of military buildup and confrontation, they argued, vindicated Patton's instincts. If the Soviet system could ultimately be broken by pressure, then perhaps in some alternate timeline where Patton's advice had been followed, Eastern Europe might have been liberated 45 years sooner. But the question of whether Patton's proposed attack would have succeeded is ultimately impossible to answer. The political reality of 1945 made his plan almost unthinkable for democratic leaders. Regardless of its military prospects, the United States and Britain were exhausted, their people desperate for peace. They'd just emerged from a catastrophe whose full horrors were still being discovered in the death camps. To ask those societies to launch another war immediately, this time against a recent ally, was asking for something they were almost certainly incapable of giving. Patton's tragedy, then, wasn't simply that he was right. It was that he may have been right at a moment when his country couldn't act on that truth. His story raises questions that haven't disappeared. When should the United States confront an emerging threat militarily, rather than relying on diplomacy and hope? How far should generals go in pushing for strategies that are militarily viable but politically impossible? When do political leaders have an obligation to override public opinion and act preemptively? And when does such action become recklessness? Similar debates echoed after the September 11th attacks, when policymakers argued over whether to use preemptive force against terrorist networks and their state sponsors. They echo again as America confronts the rise of China and the expansion of its power. Do you confront a rival power early while the balance of force favors you? Or do you wait, hoping that engagement and negotiation will moderate their ambitions? Patton represents one pole of that argument, the warrior who believes threats should be crushed while they're still weak. Eisenhower in 1945 represented the other, the coalition builder who believes in diplomacy, institutions, and the slow machinery of politics. In that sense, Eisenhower's treatment of Patton can be interpreted in two very different ways. On one reading, the system worked as intended. A general who refused to accept civilian authority was relieved. Military power remained subordinate to elected leadership. On another reading, the system failed. A general who'd correctly identified a looming strategic threat was sidelined because his warnings were inconvenient and uncomfortable. Eisenhower himself would later admit that he and others underestimated the nature of the Soviet threat in those early post-war years, but he never conceded that Patton's proposal of immediate military action against Moscow had been either wise or practical. From his perspective, the politics, the exhaustion of his troops, and the weight of obligations all made such a move irresponsible. Patton didn't care about political practicality. He cared about defeating what he saw as America's next enemy before that enemy grew stronger. That was the lens through which he viewed history, war, and his own responsibility. He died on December 21, 1945, in a hospital bed in Germany, paralyzed, far from the battlefields he cherished. At his request, he was buried not in a grand national cemetery in the United States, but among the soldiers of the Third Army in Luxembourg, the men with whom he'd fought and bled. In death, Patton became larger than life, a symbol onto which different groups projected their own values. To many conservatives, he embodied the clarity and courage to name evil and advocate force when needed. To many liberals, he represented the dark side of militarism, the man who too readily reached for war as a solution. To most of the public, he remained the fiery tank commander who'd helped break Hitler's grip on Europe. The question of whether he was right about the Soviet Union was answered not by debates, but by events. Permanent Soviet control of Eastern Europe for decades, global communist expansion, and a Cold War that reshaped world politics until the end of the 20th century. Whether his chosen solution would have prevented that history or plunged the world into something worse, we'll never know. What we do know is that George S. Patton saw, in the spring of 1945, a danger that others preferred not to acknowledge. He spoke about it plainly, refused to be quiet, and paid for that refusal with his career and possibly with his life. The leaders who rejected his warnings spent the next 45 years struggling to manage the consequences of the reality he'd tried to confront. His voice still resonates, a reminder that there are moments when the person who sees most clearly is also the one most easily labeled dangerous, unstable, or extreme. Sometimes the prophet is dismissed, the truth-teller is silenced, and the warrior who insists on naming the next enemy is removed by politicians who would rather enjoy victory than face the next storm building beyond the horizon. History has delivered its verdict on the events of 1945, though the lessons remain disputed. The millions who suffered behind the Iron Curtain, the dissidents who died in gulags, the families torn apart by secret police, the nations whose independence was crushed beneath Soviet tanks, paid the price for decisions made in that Frankfurt mansion and in the offices of Washington. Patton grasped something that comfortable men in safe rooms often forget: that peace bought through weakness is merely an intermission between wars, and that the enemy you refuse to face today will only grow more powerful tomorrow. His methods were harsh, his personality difficult, his solutions extreme. But his diagnosis of the Soviet threat proved devastatingly accurate. The general who warned that we'd fight them eventually was proven right by history itself. The only question that remains, the question that haunts strategic thinkers to this day, is whether the price of waiting was higher than the cost of acting would have been. George S. Patton lies buried in Luxembourg, surrounded by the soldiers who followed him across Europe. His headstone is simple, identical to those around it, just as he wanted. But his legacy towers over that quiet cemetery, a monument to the costs of dismissed warnings and the terrible patience of gathering storms. The threat he predicted arrived exactly as he said it would. Whether it could have been stopped in 1945, we'll never know. What we know is that he tried to stop it, and for that attempt, he was silenced. Some truths are too dangerous to speak. Some warnings arrive too early to be heard. And some warriors see too clearly for their own good.